In today's video, we're checking out the Fuji 18mm f1.4 prime lens for the Fuji X mount. Let's get into it. Welcome back, folks. My name's Shane. Before we get started, a massive thank you to Fuji for the loan of this 18mm f1.4 prime lens and their X-T4 camera. Just to let you know, I'm not being paid to make this video by them, and I don't get to keep any of the gear showcased in this video. I'll be shooting the entirety of the talking headshots with the Panasonic GH5 Mark II, and all the sample footage will be shot with this particular combination right here. Let's talk about some of the specifications and what you need to know. So the great news is you can get great shallow depth of field with this if you so choose, being that it has an f1.4 aperture, which is the equivalent of around f2.1 on full frame, and that 18mm comes in at around the 27mm equivalent. So it's not super wide, but it's a wide standard lens, and this can be used in pretty much any situation, including landscape work, cityscapes, portrait, or wedding photography. The Fuji 18mm has an all-metal construction. We also get an aperture ring that we can lock in thanks to this little push button on the top here. If we want to release it, we can push it in, and then we're good to go. This lens is dust, splash proof, and weather resistant, which works out really great because the only day I have to do this video is a day where it's raining every 5 minutes or so, and it's got no problems handling that whatsoever. If you plan on using ND filters with this lens, we get a filter thread size of 62mm. If you love to use autofocus, you'll love these linear autofocusing motors. They're near silent, fast, and very accurate both in photo and video mode. Fuji have achieved this by moving all 6 elements in unison, which really achieves fast and accurate autofocus. If you're thinking about buying this lens, odds are you're interested in potentially using it in a low light scenario. Well, I got you covered. I took this into the city here, and we did a full low light shoot using the standard picture profile and this 18mm lens set to f1.4. Let's take a look. Focus breathing on this lens is really well controlled to the point where I didn't even notice it. And this is great, especially after using Sony G Master primes, which look fantastic, but they have some of the worst focus breathing ever. The edges of the frame zoom in drastically the closer you get to the lens or the subject. So with this, you shouldn't have a problem with it whatsoever. It's been a long time since I used the Fuji X-T4, and one of the great things about it is its color science and its overall look. It has this film quality to it, even on the standard picture profile, which I really love. So I took it down to the park and I shot some really nice slow motion stuff, all handheld. In case you're not interested in shooting low light and you want to use it on either an overcast day or a bright sunny day, these are the results you can expect. This is also a great focal range for shooting video, which I've done a lot of with this particular combination. As I said on my original review of the Fuji X-T4, I think this camera has some of the best straight out of camera image quality on the standard picture profiles. It's great, and paired with this lens, you can get some really professional looking results. If you're a gimbal shooter, this lens makes a whole lot of sense. It's nice, small, compact, and lightweight, and it's very easy to balance on something like a DJI Ronin S. My only real complaint with this lens is when you switch over to manual focus, getting from infinity to minimum focusing distance takes far too long just by using the ring. It needs to be reduced. Now, being that I don't own this camera and I don't know the menu system as well as Panasonic or Sony cameras, I'm not sure whether or not I can change the linear focus throw within the camera, and if I can, please let me know in the comments section and I'll pin that most relevant post. If you plan on doing any type of vlogging, the focal length of this lens is great. You can handhold it like this, and if you're stationary or if you're moving around in this type of fashion, you're going to be fine. It's a really great focal length for that. But where it sort of lets you down is anytime you start walking. Now, the IBIS system inside of the X-T4 is great. With stabilized lenses, it's fantastic, but with this lens, being that it doesn't have any optical image stabilization, the results weren't very good when I compare it up against the likes of the GH5 Mark II. Could you use this for vlogging? Absolutely, but again, I think the best way to use it would be handheld like this. Even with the digital stabilization assisting the IBIS, it still isn't very pleasing to look at. There's a lot of weird warpy stuff going on, and the image is just far too jagged. Up next, I wanted to show you a sharpness test going all the way from f1.4 down to f16. And the thing that really surprised me the most about this lens was just how sharp the image quality is throughout the entire range. And this is a huge benefit for photographers. I love how blurred out the background can get at f1.4, but I also like how sharp it stays without any compromise in the image quality. This might be one of the most efficient prime lenses all the way through the entire aperture range. If you're a junkie for that background blur, f1.4 on the X-T4 gives you plenty. It's the equivalent of around 2.1, which is more than enough to blow out the background completely at a distance or up close. The minimum focusing distance on this lens is great, and that also works well in combination with that f1.4 aperture. So I had no problems whatsoever isolating a subject from the background, and it looks beautiful. Let's talk about the autofocus in video, because I know a lot of video shooters rely on autofocus. I'm using autofocus now, and it's one of those things where if I'm shooting on my own, you want it to work. Now, I ran numerous tests with this lens and camera combination in different autofocus modes, and my results were this. If you're using an area mode, like a box on screen mixed with face detection, it's very reliable and predictable. If you're using just face detection and you start walking back from the camera, you're gonna notice all kinds of weird pulsing going on, and it's a little bit unusable in my opinion in that type of scenario. But where it does work well is if you set up an autofocus box and you're using face detection or without face detection, the autofocus performance is great. But there's something to be mentioned about the way that the X-T4 pulls focus. It does it extremely fast. I almost find it a little jarring. Now, within the settings of the X-T4, you can adjust the speed and performance of the autofocus, but even after experimenting around with it, it just snaps on really fast. Now, some people might like that, some people won't. I find it a little less organic looking to my eye, but it's, you know, a fast, snappy autofocus system. As long as you're using the box, you shouldn't have any problems with this particular lens. Chromatic aberration and color fringing is also extremely low on this, to the point where I didn't even notice it looking back at any of my photos or video. So that's always a good thing, and that really comes down to how you'll be shooting with the lens. In my test, this performed really well. Lens flaring is also really well controlled. I did notice it a few times when I was doing that low light shoot, but it's nothing that other lenses wouldn't suffer with, especially when light's scattering from all over the place. So overall, a really good performer. When I first put this lens on the camera body in photo mode, the aperture ring worked fine. In video mode, it didn't do anything. So I had to reach out to Fuji and say, hey, how come I can't use the aperture ring in video mode? Shouldn't that just be on by default, being that the lens has that built into the hardware? But no, I had to go into the menu settings and change something, and I'll leave information for that down in the description. It was just one of those things that really confused me. I hope on the next firmware update for the Fuji X-T4, they have it so anytime you attach a lens with an aperture ring, it just works by default. You shouldn't have to go menu diving just to enable a feature of the lens. At the end of the day, I found this Fuji 18mm f1.4 to be a pleasure to use on the Fuji X-T4. With the exception for vlogging and also its manual focus feel. With those two things aside, I think this really gets the big thumbs up. The image quality is spectacular. The low light results completely shocked me. On the same night, I shot with my Sony FX3, and this really held its own peg with this lens in the low light scenario. But the Fuji colors, man, they're great. So if you want to get a cinematic looking video, you can absolutely get it with this lens. If you want to take great photos that really help isolate your subject, you can do that as well. And this stays tack sharp throughout the entire range. A massive thank you to Fuji for sending this out. I really appreciate it. If you want to check it out, links will be below. Let us know if you shoot with the Fuji, and maybe I'll do some more videos down the track. Thanks again. Catch you soon. See ya.